Good morning, and I hope it's not too late to wish you a Happy New Year, especially art-filled. The lecture today, The Power of Relics, Art of Reliquaries in Buddhist Traditions, will be given by Dr. Sonya Quintanilla, the George P. Bickford Curator of Indian and Southeast Asian Art at the Cleveland Museum of Art in Cleveland, Ohio. Dr. Quintanilla completed her PhD at Harvard University, where her dissertation focused on early Indian sculpture. Prior to accepting the position in Cleveland, Sonya was the curator of Asian art at the San Diego Museum of Art from 2004 to 2012, and we all docents enjoyed her so much, and a little bit sad, but happy for you. During her tenure at our museum, Sonya curated special exhibitions of Japanese, Chinese, Indian, Himalayan, Southeast Asian, and Islamic art, and installed the expanded Asian permanent collection galleries featuring the Edwin Binney III collection of Indian paintings. Additionally, Sonya curated the groundbreaking exhibition Rhythms of India, The Age of Nandalal Bose, which involved the partnership between the National Gallery of Modern Art in New Delhi and our museum, and which traveled to the Philadelphia Museum of Art in 2008. In 2012, her curated exhibition Into India, South Asian Paintings from the San Diego Museum of Art was on view at the Thyssen-Bornemisza Museum of Art in Madrid, Spain. She also taught Indian and Tibetan art history at the University of California in Irvine, Los Angeles, and San Diego. Sonya was responsible for the reinstallation of the museum's permanent Asian art collection, which will be displayed in a newly refurbished gallery space opening on February 9, 2013 as the Art of East Asia exhibition place, just in time to ring in the Chinese New Year. It is a great pleasure for all of us to welcome Sonya back to our museum. Enjoy the lecture.
Oh, it feels so good to be home. I have to say, okay, Cleveland's great museum, but there's nothing like coming back. And honestly, I step one foot back on the loading dock, and it's as though I never left. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you so much, Ruth, for organizing this lecture, and for the whole Docent Council for inviting me here. It was over a year ago when we planned this talk, so I'm so glad to have had this chance to come back and speak to all of you today. And thank you, Monica, for making sure everything was in place and everything was in order. I also want to thank Greg and Patrick and Justine for getting everything together behind the scenes. So hello, and yes, Happy New Year to all of you. I must say, Cleveland's great, and everyone's asking me, how do you like it? How do you like it? It's great. It really is a wonderful place, and I'm flourishing there, getting to know it. But honestly, I haven't even met a single docent yet, and I've kind of done this on purpose because I think they can't possibly be like our docents here. And so I'm putting it off as long as possible, and because this group right here will always be my docents. So thank you so much for carrying forward my vision, even though I'm not here on site all the time anymore. But I will be back. I'll be back the week of February 4th, so I'll be doing the docent walkthrough for the new permanent collection gallery spaces, which, oh my gosh, I hate to overstate things, but dramatic new renovation is an understatement. You guys, it's really exciting. So anyway, I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. So today I'm here to talk with you about a special core component of the special exhibition that's currently on view of the masterworks from the Suzhou Art Museum. It's a tight little exhibition, objects that I selected while I was on site there in 2010. And this is a view of the city of Suzhou. It's a city that has very ancient components. This is a view from the top of one of the pagodas that shows the elements of the old city and then a very modern new city as well. But this is a reconstructed memorial hall to the preceptor of the region, who was a strong leader during the 6th century BCE. So really the roots of the cultural heritage of Suzhou run unbroken since the 6th century BC. So just a view of the canals of the old old city. It's a city that flourished not only because of what it's so famous for, that is its intellectual and cultural contributions to the Chinese literati society throughout the centuries, but also because of the trade and economy that the silk production factories and manufacturing and the artistry of silk production and weaving had, and the canals linking the city's heart to the Yangtze River that would take the materials on export to all parts of China and beyond in Asia and to the West. So Suzhou, being such a place that produced major cultural achievements, one of the most famous names on the world stage today is the architect I.M. Pei, and he actually happened to be born in Suzhou, and this was one of his great achievements at the end of his career, was to design the Suzhou Art Museum. So the new building of the Suzhou Art Museum is a great tribute to the traditional architecture of the city itself, and the waterways and gardens and contemplative feel that characterizes so much of the gardens and architecture of the traditional city of Suzhou itself. So this is a view of the museum that was inaugurated in 2006, and our own director, Derek Cartwright, was there for the inauguration at the time. And this is a view of the waterways and walkways with a very clean and modern contemporary feel, but with a total bow to the traditional garden formats for which Suzhou is so famous. He even puts in elements that are reminiscent of, landscape painting of the Chinese literati Ming dynasty, for which Suzhou was a center, and people can actually walk through these landscapes that have these layers of rocks that from a distance, and especially on misty days, look as though you can enter into a literati painting itself. So within this museum, there's a gallery. So Amy Galpin and I, most of you all know Amy Galpin. She's our curator for Arts of the Americas. She went with me as part of an ongoing series of relationships that are part of the sistership relationships that this museum has with the Suzhou Art Museum. And we had sent 50 American paintings from this collection to be on view in Suzhou, and in exchange, and so she was going to courier those paintings back, and I went to select the objects for the reciprocal exhibition that is currently on view. And one of the galleries that just captivated me, and there's so many galleries dedicated to every kind of historical and artistic period and discipline throughout the history of Chinese art. But there's a gallery that had things in it that I had never seen before. And these were reliquaries of the 10th century, an aspect of Buddhism in China that has hardly been introduced to the West whatsoever. We're accustomed to Buddhism during the Tang Dynasty and art of the Han Dynasty, but Buddhism during the Sung Dynasty is something that's very little known, and that's because many of the objects pertinent to Sung Dynasty Buddhism in southern China were only recently excavated, like in the late 1970s, and the publications are dominantly in Chinese, and none of these reliquaries have been seen in the West. So in my negotiations with the director, I said, we've got to get some of these reliquaries to San Diego, because that is something that will make for a very special exhibition. Now these objects, this is one example that is a stone casket with the Buddha of the present and the Buddha of the future on the other side, and inside were sutras and esoteric texts that show that tantric Buddhism had spread to southern China by this period, and they were found together with a number of small metal objects that were arranged as part of a three-dimensional mandala. Now, these caskets and reliquaries came from two pagodas that basically define the perimeters of this old city of Suzhou. One is a pagoda up and on a hill. It's made of brick. It's called the Tiger Hill Pagoda. And then the other one is made of wood, and it's down nestled in the city on the southwest side. So this is the approach to Tiger Hill, and now the pagoda is kind of in part of this great garden, like acres and acres of gardens that one can stroll through as kind of a park. As you get closer to the pagoda, there are natural springs and there are pillars that kind of anticipate the final arrival at the monument at the top of the hill. And this is the monument that was built in the 10th century. So the 10th century was a period of major artistic production during in Suzhou itself. So this is a close-up of the 7-storied pagoda at Tiger Hill, and you can't go up inside. And this whole Tiger Hill Park had the most charming signage. For example, in order to keep people from climbing into the pagoda, which is definitely an attractive place to go in and clamber around, but it's a loving care cultural relic, so please do not climb up. And so since you can't climb up the pagoda, the best thing to do is stroll around the grounds. And I thought I'd bring along a picture of Amy as she's walking through the bamboo groves just at the foot of the pagoda. Now then, the second pagoda at Suzhou is called the Reiguang Pagoda, which means the pagoda of brilliant light, shining light. And so often, places where real relics of the body of the Buddha are located are said in text to emit a miraculous rays of light. So this is a 7-story pagoda. It actually has its origins during the 3rd century, but it was rebuilt several times, and especially in the 10th century. And in the 10th century is when a number of these tantric Buddhist reliquaries, sculptures, were interred in the core of the pagoda itself. Now, it's kind of, as you saw, nestled in the more urban heart of the center. And this is a pagoda made of wood, and you can climb up inside. Amy and I decided to go all the way to the top, and it was cold. It was February, and you get up to the that 6th and 7th story. The wind kind of whips through, but it's fascinating because the whole center of the pagoda is penetrated by this axis mundi pillar. It's a pillar that is just a single pillar that goes from the chamber at the bottom and the base of the pagoda all the way to the finial at the top, and is ultimately linked to early Buddhist notions of cosmology with the axis of the world that links the earth to the realm of liberation. So I guess, that's part of the reason why also they didn't allow people to climb up inside the Tiger Hill Pagoda, because look what happens to these places. They get graffiti, they get all messed up. Anyway, inside that Reiguang Pagoda, we have we have 2 of the reliquaries on view in our exhibition here. 2 that came from the core of the wooden pagoda, and they are of a very particular and unique typography. These reliquaries are in the shape of what are called King Ashoka stupas, King Ashoka reliquaries, and they're considered to be miraculous reliquaries. So they were miraculous objects, and there are a bunch of them that were made that all have the same form and the same iconographies. So this is one of them that's on view. There's a detail. And this is the other one. And they all are supposed to be, from the Chinese point of view in the 10th century, an understanding of what the reliquaries of the King Ashoka of India, who lived in the 3rd century BC, what they looked like when he divided up the actual physical remains of the body of the Buddha into 84,000 little special reliquaries and then distributed them all over the world. And so they are now recreating their image of what the King Ashoka miraculous reliquaries looked like. And then these were buried in the pagodas at Suzhou and several other important pilgrimage centers in the Suzhou region, so in South China. So what we have in southern China, with Suzhou being kind of a center, Suzhou and nearby Ningpo, these are areas where tantric esoteric Buddhism is coming in to southern China, and they're also looking back to trying to find the original, actual bodily, corporeal remains of the Buddha as they were distributed by Emperor Ashoka. So we're going to explore how how Buddhists in Suzhou, in China, in the 10th century, were understanding what Buddhism was about, what the authenticity of what the real body of the Buddha was, and why that was important, and how they understood the roots of Indian Buddhism in India itself. So just to show you a couple other examples of the Emperor Ashoka, or King Ashoka reliquaries, and they're scattered all over the place. Like there's one in the Harvard Sackler Gallery in Cambridge. There's one there are a couple in private collections in Japan, or monastery collections in Japan. Another one in China. This one had a big fancy gate made for it at what was called the Ashoka, it's the Ayuwang Si, so it's the Ashoka, like Emperor Ashoka temple in Ningpo, where one of these reliquaries with the actual physical remains of the Buddha were supposed to be. And the way that these reliquaries were interred in the pagodas is that there's a special relic chamber, which is accessible if you dig down to it, which is different from, they were never accessible in India. But in China, the relic chambers were accessible, and the reliquaries were set up on altars. And to me, this is very reminiscent of the way Chinese ritual bronzes that were set up for ancestor ritual worship were presented in tombs. And so this is kind of a tomb-like arrangement, but instead of like vessels for preparation of wine and meat, you instead have these special reliquaries with what are supposed to be actual physical remains of the body of the Buddha. Now, the descriptions of what's inside these reliquaries are, again, kind of miraculous. So the relic itself is described as being these kind of like little pearls of energy, and they can emit light. And they just look like little pearls, and they kind of are anti-gravitational. And then there's always like one strand of hair and one fingernail. So, which is really bizarre, because you would think that, if there are 84,000 of these reliquaries, the Buddha had 84,000 fingernails. But each, I suppose you could believe it for the strands of hair. But anyway, the strands of hair apparently were like little coils. And if you could take the strand of hair, and if you pulled it all the way out, it's like 8 feet long. And it's bright blue, which is funny because they're probably seeing paintings from Central Asia of the image of the Buddha where they use lapis lazuli as the pigment for the Buddha's hair instead of black. So they said the Buddha had bright blue hair. And of course, he had the snail shell curls. And so if you'd pull it out and then you'd let it go, it'd curl all up again into a little snail shell. And the fingernails, though, there was some kind of controversy about one of the reliquaries because the fingernail was kind of yellowish, kind of like an ordinary dead person's fingernail. But the Buddha, was supposed to have kind of lacquer red fingernails. And so they were suspect that these reliquaries were actually authentic. Anyway, so that was the contents of these King Ashoka miraculous lingta, they're called, or reliquaries. And they were housed together with a bunch of just fancy stuff. So basically like coins and jewelry and like pots full of precious elements. So this is just a view from the top of one of the excavations where you see the King Ashoka style reliquary here, surrounded by a bunch of coins and vessels full of treasure, basically. Okay, so back to the King Ashoka reliquary that's on view here at the museum. There's an inscription on it. And so it's dated to the year 955. And there must be something to this. All of the ones that we've found that have been dated are all within this decade between 955 and 965. And many of them are dated, but they're just right in the middle of the 10th century where there was just this sudden burgeoning of an interest in these miraculous King Ashoka reliquaries. And this one was given just by a devout Buddhist for the sake of honoring his fifth wife who had died. And he basically sold off all her clothes and belongings to purchase the metal to produce this reliquary. And then he had consecrated real relics of the body of the Buddha inside this reliquary and had it interred in the stupa in Suzhou in order for his fifth wife to be remembered and in daily offerings in perpetuity. Now, those reliquaries that we just looked at from Suzhou in China look really different from the way reliquaries ever looked in India. So even though they're sourcing India for the appearance and the meaning of these reliquaries, all the archaeological evidence of what reliquaries look like in India itself show no relationship to the King Ashoka Lingta from China whatsoever. This is an example of a reliquary from the 1st century. It's basically a vase, which almost symbolizes a kind of new birth. So it's kind of the rebirth into nirvana, as it were, with the relics of the Buddha inside. Many of these reliquaries contain some of our most important historical documents. So real kind of donative inscriptions are carved on the reliquaries. These are royal donations where the king is consecrating and dedicating relics of the Buddha inside a stupa, and then it's interred in this monument, never to be seen again. So the power of the relic and the power of the inscription on the reliquary were never actually intended to be known or seen by anybody, but they have to be there in order to empower the sacred site to be a place of worship and to be a monument where people will come and have their prayers be fruitful. Inside those pots, like the casket itself, like we just saw, is usually another casket, and then there are other precious elements, bits of gold, coins. The coins are always really useful because they give us a sense of the dating of the object if it's not dated by the inscription, and then other kind of just precious elements that serve to, ornament and adorn really what is considered to be the actual body of the Buddha himself, even though it's just a little bit of it. The relic stands in for the physical body of the Buddha, so it's adorned. And sometimes the reliquaries themselves are basically like luxury items, like silver goblets. And this silver goblet has one of the most important historical inscriptions in the language of Kharoshthi to give us a sense of 1st century history. Again, these are foreign rulers who are coming in from Central Asia and dedicating relics of the Buddha that are kept in little reliquaries within these larger reliquary objects that look like luxury items. Another example is the very, very famous Bimaran reliquary made of gold and set with carnelian. And some of the earliest images of the Buddha himself are found on some of these early kind of precious object reliquaries. This is a very famous reliquary of Kanishka. It's a terrible photograph, but it's the only one that shows it together with what was found inside, and that is with a coin of the emperor, and then this crystal reliquary that was buried inside this metal casket that actually holds the ash, the actual stuff, the sliver of bone or the grains of ash, of which are from the cremation of the Buddha. Oftentimes, that crystal central reliquary, and this is very tiny. It's only maybe an inch or 2 inches tall. Sometimes they're in the form of a stupa, which is the Indian funerary monument in which most of the reliquaries were interred in the center. Solid hemispherical domes, and so the reliquary itself is kind of a small, miniature, crystalline version of the whole monument within which it's buried. And just in the middle here, in this little chamber, would be just the tiny little piece from the remains of the cremation of the body of the Buddha. Sometimes the caskets just have lotus flowers and animals, just the kind of imagery that you would find on the exteriors of stupas themselves. Now, coming back to our Suzhou reliquary, so the kind of imagery that you see on Indian reliquaries are kind of precious imagery, animals, flowers, sometimes iconic images of the Buddha themselves. But in China, these Lingta, these King Ashoka reliquaries, have stories on them. And they all have the same exact stories. So all 4 sides are all 4 particular scenes from 4 of the Buddha's previous lifetimes. So on one side, the Buddha was once born in a past life as a king whose name was Chandraprabha. And it's interesting because all of these, what they're called Jataka stories, they're stories of his previous lifetimes. All the ones on these King Ashoka Lingta show the Buddha when he was born as a king in a previous birth, and his virtuous actions of extreme charity that are the message of each one of these four stories that then are said to have propelled him karmically. They're such generous actions that they propelled him to be reborn into a better rebirth so that he could actually achieve enlightenment. So that's kind of the connective thread of all of them. Now, this particular one shows the Buddha when he was born as a king named Chandraprabha, and there's a neighboring king who was his enemy and wanted to take over his land. And so he sent out an edict saying that anyone who brings me the head of Chandraprabha will get a big reward. And so then a quote-unquote heretic, as the text calls him, comes and tries to behead the king here, and the king says, "Oh, don't worry about it. Go ahead and behead me because you'll need that reward. That'll be really helpful for you." And so he allows himself to be beheaded, and so then he gets reborn into another form in which he performs other acts of kindness and generosity. This is where he was born as King Sudhira, and there was a blind Brahmin who begged, "So you have 2 good eyes, I have no good eyes. Why don't you give me one of your eyes and then we'll both have one?" He said, "Okay." So he had his surgeon came and gouged out one of his eyes and gave it to the Brahmin, and then he was so overcome by how good it felt to have given this eye and restored sight to this Brahmin that he went ahead and gave the other eye as well, so that the Brahmin could have really complete vision, because he said that the vision of true knowledge and omniscience is much more valuable than actually seeing with 2 eyes, and that was much more satisfactory. So then he gets reborn again as King Shibi. Now, King Shibi, okay, those first 2 stories that I just told you are not popular in India, but they were really popular on these Chinese reliquaries, and this is the only one of the 4 that was pretty popular in India too. King Shibi was one who was a good and righteous king, and then one day a dove comes flying into his throne room and perches on his shoulder and says, "Save me. I am being chased by a hawk who wants to eat me." And the hawk comes in and says, "Look, it's what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to eat doves and these smaller, weaker creatures. That's what, that's how I survive." So King Shibi said, "Well, okay, this bird has come to me for protection, and therefore I must protect this. I'm bound with my duty as a king to protect someone who comes to me for refuge. So I will give you equivalent in weight to this dove, my own flesh for you to eat, so you won't go hungry." And so he slices a chunk out of his leg. So this was a pretty popular story, actually, as early as the 2nd century in India. This is King Shibi here in a panel from Mathura, where he's slicing off a big hunk of flesh from his thigh, and this is a scale that's being held so that the weight of his flesh can equal the weight of the bird. It gets more kind of dramatic as the centuries go on, and King Shibi's here on the floor kind of sawing away at himself, and the throne is empty, and the courtiers are sort of swooning, and the scales are being held here with the little bird on this side, and he's sawing off his flesh. And then up in Gandhara, which was more influenced by Greco-Roman art, and so a little more realistic, he's fainting from the pain, and his queen is kind of holding him up, and here the scale is held, and he's not doing himself, but instead someone else is cutting off his flesh. It was very popular across Central Asia in paintings this is a painting from Dunhuang. It occurs over and over and over again in the cave temple paintings across Central Asia, which were these oasis monasteries, monastic centers that were seminal to the propagation of Buddhism from India to China, especially in the kind of middle centuries of the 1st millennium. So this is King Shibi in the center, having his leg cut apart. And then the 4th story on these King Ashoka reliquaries is one where the Buddha, born as a prince in a previous life, gives his whole entire body. So in the first story, he gives his head. In the second, he gives his eyes. In the third, he gives his flesh. And in the fourth, he gives his whole body. And this is a story that, it's something that's kind of nostalgic for me. My mother, a lot of you may know, my mother, Marilyn Rhee, is a scholar of Chinese Buddhist art, and she still does actually teach Asian art history at Smith College. And one of her students was an art student who made a woodcut of this very scene from Japan. It's the Jataka story that's painted on wood in a very early Buddhist temple in Japan, in Nara, from the 7th century. And her student, back in the early 70s, did a woodcut print of it and gave it to my mother as a gift. And it always hung in our home while I was growing up. I always remember it, and kind of asking. This was a very kind of graphic piece in my home, and asking my mother, "What's happening there?" And she would tell me the story that once the Buddha was born as a prince, and he and his brothers went riding through the landscape and came across a tigress and her cubs who were starving. And the tigress had been so long since she had been able to eat anything. Her milk had dried up and she could barely move. And the princess said, "Okay, let's ride back to the city, get some meat, and bring it back and feed her." And Mahasattva, which was the name of the prince who would become the Buddha, he said that, there was no way that they could make it back in time before she would die. It was days to ride back and forth. And so he went to the top of a cliff, and he removed his clothes, and he just leapt off the cliff and shattered himself to death on the rocks below so that the tigress and her cubs could survive. Very graceful painting, one of the first kind of transmissions of Buddhist stories from China to Japan. And this is a painting from a little bit later from China, from the same Central Asian site of Dunhuang at the Buddhist oasis, where here kind of Mahasattva, though, is sort of floating down on a cloud. But this is the tigress and her hungry cubs feasting on his corpse. That has shattered at the bottom of the cliff. And what happened is that when the brothers came back with the meat, the tigers had gone, and they saw like the clothes of their younger brother, and they realized what had happened. They come with the parents, the king and queen, and they establish a pagoda. They set up on that very site a place to memorialize his great deed of kindness, and they took his clothes and put them in a reliquary and made that be the central, potent focus for worship. And so that becomes kind of a model for what a monument for worship of a relic, even of the Buddha in a previous life. So then this pagoda was built to house a relic of the Buddha in his last life as an enlightened being. And so just looking at some of the sources for monuments like this, for relics of the Buddha. The first one for the Buddha after he is born as Siddhartha, when he achieves enlightenment, occurs actually right after he decides to depart and renounce his life as a prince to go off and seek meditation and seek liberation in the forest. And what he does is he leaves under cover of night secretly, and he comes to the forest, and he what the texts say basically is that he cuts his hair off. He cuts off his hair, like shaves his head. He basically gives himself a tonsure to become a mendicant. And he takes his hair and he throws it up in the sky. And there the gods catch it in the sky so it doesn't fall to the ground. They take his hair that he's cut off, which is in India, and with rules of purity and pollution, any kind of like remnants of cut hair are really kind of dirty, and they're only like low caste people can touch it. But because this is the being who's about to achieve enlightenment, the gods are able to hold his cast off hair clippings, but not only just touch them and rescue them, but then inter them, like build a temple for them and make them be the focus for worship in heaven. And so this is a scene from heaven in a very early relief from India from the 2nd century BC, where they've built a temple, which is basically in the format of a palace, where they've set up an altar. And on the altar, and the way that the early sculptors depict the hair, is it's in the form of a turban. So because it's kind of gross to show hair, they don't, especially this is ornament for a sacred site, they used what's considered to be kind of jewelry, which is the turban that everybody wears. And so the turban is set up on this little tray, and it's surrounded by flower garlands and gems. There's an umbrella placed over it, and the umbrella is a symbol for divinity or kingship with garlands hanging from it, and there are attendants praying here, and then there are the gods of heaven who are performing worship, and in front there's this kind of perpetual orchestra and dance troupe that are dancing in heaven and singing and performing for the sake of the Buddha's hair relic, his turban, that is enshrined in a temple in heaven. And this becomes recurringly a pretty important kind of image on Buddhist monuments. You often see reliefs of the gods in heaven worshiping the headdress, the hair of Prince Siddhartha at the moment of his renunciation of life as a prince. And it becomes very important, especially in places like Thailand, where in the most popular text, and you'll see in the next rotation of Gallery 9, we're going to open our Pramalai manuscript to the page, where the monk who's featured in the manuscript goes to heaven in order to worship the hair relic of the Buddha in its temple in Indra's heaven. So after the Buddha, so that's the Buddha's first relic. But after he achieves enlightenment and goes and makes all kinds of converts, he finally dies and he goes off to nirvana. But still, his body is here on Earth. And there are quite a few depictions in Gandhara and in China of the death of the Buddha, but very few. In fact, nothing until the 1st century AD in India of the death of the Buddha. It was sort of too inauspicious. But these more Western related territories that don't have the same taboos against death and the body, a dead body, did show them very frequently. And this is an example of the Buddha as at the moment of death, where he is surrounded by his mourning disciples and the Mallas. The Mallas were the names is the group of people who lived in the area, in the territory where the Buddha actually died. The Buddha died in a grove right outside of town. It's always these what they're called twin shala trees, and the yakshis, or nature divinities that populate these trees, came out and manifested themselves at the moment of the death. The Mallas are here kind of tearing out their hair and very upset at the death of the Buddha. Then they took his body, so the Mallas kind of took care of his body, and so did the disciples of the Buddha, performed funerary rites, put it in a casket, waited for the senior disciple to come along, and then the body was cremated. And it burned and burned and burned, and they stoked and stoked and stoked the fire, but no matter what they did, the bones wouldn't burn. So the hair and nails all burned. I don't know how they wound up in China, but the bones remained, and then they were kind of bundled together with a cloth over them. They stuck an umbrella on top, and they were then worshipped. There's a detail. They're all worshipped all together at first, there in the kingdom of the Mallas, and they guarded them very jealously. But the Buddha had a whole lot of followers, and he had converted kings from all over northern India, and so there were 7 other kings and all of the Buddha's followers, and they wanted relics too. Why should the Mallas have the body, the cremated remains of the Buddha? And so they got all upset, and they decided to start a war. and invade the territory of the Mallas so that they could get the relics for themselves. How quickly they forget, right? The teachings of peace and nonviolence. So anyway, so they all these other 8 kings kind of suit up, and these are the fortified ramparts of the city at the center of the kingdom of the Mallas, and it's populous looking and watching all these soldiers coming, blowing all on their horns, and they're all in their armor. This is what early Indian armor looked like. They took thick cloth and wrapped it around their stomachs, and so they come with all these are the kings that are riding in on war elephants. And, everything is all ready to start the war. Every time you see one of these umbrellas, it means it's one of the kings. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then on the other side of the architrave, This is a 1st century BC gateway at the Stupa monument at Sanchi. They then the War of the Relics, and you have 7 and 8. So our 8 kings, seven kings are there laying siege to the capital of the Mallas, and this is inside the fortress itself on the other end of the architrave, where here's the 8th king. The king of the Mallas himself is surrounded by all his ladies, wondering what to do. Getting ready to fight. They've decided, okay, we'll strap reindeer horns on our lions and we'll go fight. That's just the artist having fun. But it was, you see there's a little pot under here, under the throne of the Malla king. That means he's about to give something away. So that's kind of foreshadowing, showing that, well, actually, they will work it out, and he will give portions of the reliquary away. But not before there's just a big... they don't actually start fighting, but, here they are, just like rows and rows of elephants and soldiers just all drawing their bows, aiming them in, and there's like hot oil going to be thrown, and everybody's kind of trying to ford the moat. This is a moat down here. These are the soldiers, setting up the ropes to scale the ramparts. The defenses are all set up. They're ready to go. And then finally... a Brahmin, of all people, talks sense into them and says, look, why don't you all take a portion of the relics? Everybody can have some. So they divide the relics. This is a sculpture from Gandhara, into 8 separate pieces, and this is how they're shown, these kind of cross-hatched lumps. And so there are going to be 8 bundles of relics, and there's a 9th pot in which the ashes and embers are swept up and kept, and those get taken off to another place. And then back to the same relief again. This is kind of brilliant. I love this relief at Sanchi. It's really dense, showing the siege on the Mallas. But then at the very same time, it shows the resolution. Up here, you see the elephants leaving the city with these little boxes on their heads. Those are the relics of the Buddha after the division of the relics. So you have the siege at the bottom, and then when you see the elephants going the opposite direction, it has the relics. And what's so amazing is that the kings have the royal umbrella over their heads as they're coming in, but as they're leaving, the royal umbrella goes over the relics. And the king takes the subsidiary position. So here is the king leaving, and he's in the horse's chariot now. And the royal elephant, these are the drivers of the elephant with the elephant goad. Now it's the relic of the Buddha that gets the pride of place on the royal elephant with the royal umbrella on top. And here's another one. So these little boxes of the elephants leaving and going in the opposite direction show the dispersal of the relics in the casket. So coming in to fight and then leaving peacefully with the relic casket and the umbrella on top. And so they go off to their 8 separate kingdoms, and they build stupas around the relic caskets. And here's a relief depiction of an early stupa. They're all kind of the same look in India. They're these solid hemispherical domes surrounded by railings that demarcate the sacred space from the everyday world. And this is completely solid. And the relic casket with the relics, the little bits of cremated remains of the body of the Buddha, are in that casket inside this solid mound. No one can ever see it. No one can ever get to it unless you destroy the monument. It's in there somewhere. And it just gives the power for the monument to be sacred. Without the relic, the monument is just a memorial. It's not an actual place of worship. And then on top, the royal umbrellas are placed. This is the actual stupa this is a depiction of the stupa that is in the city of Kushinagara, where the Buddha died, and it was famous for being populated by foreigners. And then a lot of the actual stupa remains, the monuments themselves that survive in India that are surrounded by the railings, like the most popular theme on those railings is a relic procession. So basically the procession of royal elephants with relic caskets on their heads. And it's a joyous thing for the dispersal of relics. It's just one after another for like 8-10 feet, and then they're just interrupted by dance performances and music performances. It's like a big happy parade. And some of the elephants spit jewels. And this is another one from another city. That one was from Bardhut. This one is Besnagar. Same thing. Big relic caskets on the royal elephants' heads, and they finally wind up at a stupa, which is then worshipped. Now, what happens is that those 8 stupas are not enough for everybody, especially when you get to the 3rd century, and there's the first Buddhist king who unifies all of India, whose name was Emperor Ashoka, the same Ashoka of our Chinese miraculous stupa reliquaries. King Ashoka lived in the 3rd century BC and was the grandson of Chandragupta Maurya, who took on the Seleucid successors of Alexander the Great, and conquered them and established the first empire of northern India, called the Maurya Empire. And it was under Ashoka, his grandson, that the Maurya Empire actually extended and unified India to a greater extent than it has actually since. From Afghanistan all the way to Sri Lanka, India was unified under one ruler. And the way he kind of made sure there was peace and stability in the kingdom is he created monuments with special edicts, introduced a writing system that propagated the tenets and laws and ethics of Buddhism, which is basically nonviolence. Now, so in typical Indian fashion, they just can't tell a linear story. So what you have to do is say, well, why is it that King Ashoka became this great Buddhist king that established, all these wonderful monuments all over India and generated peace and stability? Well, that's because in a previous lifetime, he was a little boy playing on the side of the road and the Buddha walked by. And he was like playing restaurant with his little cousin, and they were making mud pies out of dirt on the side of the road. And the Buddha comes walking by and just totally guilelessly and innocently, he takes a handful of the dirt that he was like making this kind of imaginary food and make-believe food out of and dumps it in the Buddha's alms bowl. And so, and this gift of dirt is the act of of charity and almsgiving that was just that welled up in this little boy named Jaya naturally, so that it was that karmic action that propelled him to be reborn as a great king, who would then be the one to really establish Buddhism as a state religion in India and also have these far-reaching influences across all of Asia in the future. And to have his name be renowned, we're still talking about him today. Anyway, this is this is Ashoka right here under the royal umbrella, getting off the royal elephant as he's coming to visit the Bodhi tree, which is the place where the Buddha achieved enlightenment. And this occurred just at the right after he finished building 84,000 stupas all over the whole world, or his known world. And what he had done was to go to the original 8 stupas and break them open, find the relics within them, and divide them up into 84,000 pieces, which means, a little 1 grain of ash for each stupa. But it doesn't matter, how big the relic is. It just has to be the authentic relic, and it will still stand in for the presence of the Buddha on this earth, the continued presence of his actual body, even though he himself has gone off to nirvana. The only stupa he had a little trouble with of the original 8 was this one. It's called the Ramagrama stupa, because the place where it was established got flooded and it was underwater, and it was guarded by these snakes, and so he had a little difficulty getting to that. And texts vary as to whether he actually finally got into it, but this is a wonderful depiction of this stupa with all these serpents around the bottom. These are serpent divinities with snake hoods behind them, kind of knots of serpents just wrapped around the stupa, and then 100 umbrellas coming out of the top of these royal umbrellas. You just stick as many of them in to this very top portion of the stupa as possible. Then Ashoka set up these monumental pillars at the site of each one of his stupas that had his edicts on them. This is one that is of the 4 lines in the 4 directions. And these pillars were such imposing symbols. I mean, monoliths that would stretch to 30, 40 feet in the sky. They hadn't even had stone sculpture in India before this time. It was definitely, it made the stupa be a place to everyone had to see. It made it a wonder. And even though most people in India who weren't Buddhists thought it was completely anathema to go to a place where there was a dead person, a dead thing, kind of like a cremation ground that was very inauspicious, why should they worship there? They still had to go, and many converts to Buddhism were affected because of these pillars. But it's interesting that by the 14th century, these pillars were effective, and it was as a symbol, even though the name of King Ashoka in India by this time had gotten completely forgotten. So we have documents of the Sultanate rulers of India of the 14th century who dragged an Ashokan pillar 400 miles just so he could set it up in his capital at Delhi. But no one could read the inscription at that time. They didn't even know who King Ashoka was. He'd been completely forgotten. And he even had court chroniclers, so-called, read the inscription saying, oh, in such and such a year during the 14th century, a great Muslim king will come and move the pillar 400 miles. Anyway, but now, since James Prinsep, an 18th century Indologist, he was able to crack the inscriptions, the Brahmi inscriptions, and read them. And now, the Ashokan capital is kind of one of the most potent symbols for the nation state of India itself. Sanchi is one of the stupa sites that still stands from the time of Ashoka. It was expanded. The actual Ashokan stupa was a little smaller. It was expanded, and then the gateways were added. The pillar, this is the stump of the pillar that Ashoka set up there, fell down, so it's in the museum. But it was 4 lions again, and when the gateway was set up, they put 4 lions on the gateway just to pay tribute to Ashoka's pillar itself. So this is the form of the stupa in India, and it has the pillar at the top. It has the royal umbrellas at the top. Gateways that have imagery pertaining to scenes from the life of the Buddha, scenes from his past life, voluptuous women, imagery pertaining to the waters and to birth, auspiciousness and prosperity, and just panel after panel of basically showing non-Buddhists what you're supposed to do at a stupa. You're supposed to leave your handprints there. You're supposed to garland it with flowers. You're supposed to circumambulate. You pray. Gods are supposed to come down and bring flowers. You're supposed to come and deck it with garlands of flowers and kind of and honor it and worship it. And these are acts of good karma that will allow your wishes to come true. And so this is one of the most dominant kinds of scenes on stupas themselves, is basically kind of signposting to everyone who comes that, yeah, even though there's gross dead stuff like nails and hair and ash of a corpse, it's still a worshipful place. And it's the relic that makes it so. And so it's kind of a reconciliation of what was a cultural paradox within India itself. Now, if you look at this top portion of the Indian stupa, it's square at the bottom, and it has these little projections kind of sometimes at the corners, and it has these umbrellas at the top. And maybe that's the inspiration for the shape of the Emperor Ashoka reliquaries that we have here, and that were so popular during the 10th century in southern China, where, yes, there are these scenes of the past lives of the Buddha on the outside. And then these are umbrellas, but they didn't understand what they were. And in Chinese, they're called dew catchers, like little dishes for catching dew. And so the transmission of form and the transmission of ideas from radically different cultures, one to the next, during a period where Ashoka had, was becoming forgotten in India, and in China, his memory is so potent that they have to build major monuments and inter these miraculous reliquaries as receptacles for the actual physical presence of the Buddha. That shows the power of the real authentic presence of the relic as a monument to empower major monuments that can galvanize a society to come together, to pray, to make offerings, and to do their best to perform the kind of karmic actions that the Buddha did in his past life in the hopes of achieving enlightenment themselves. So thank you so much. That comes to the end of my talk.
Buddha cutting his hair off and the gods bringing it up to heaven. What do we mean by heaven when we talk about stories like that?
Right.
And also, is heaven the same as nirvana?
Okay, so in the Buddhist worldview, Buddhist cosmology is such that the world in which that can be populated, in which you can be born, they have a number of different levels, and these levels are kind of in accordance with where you deserve to be according to your own actions. The lowest are hells, and there are several hells. There are hot hells and there are cold hells. And then there's the layer that's a little bit better than hell, but still awful. It's the realm of the hungry ghosts. And then there's the realm of the animals. And then there's the human realm. And above the human realm, there's the realm of demigods. And then there's the realm of the gods, which is what we consider heaven. But it's still within the world of what's called samsara, which is the place where you can possibly be constantly born, die, and reborn, and they all of these realms necessarily include some kind of inevitable suffering. Nirvana is outside that altogether, and that is the real goal of liberation in the Buddhist tradition, is to be outside the realm of nirvana. But nobody knows what it's like because nobody's come back from nirvana to tell us about it. All we know is what it's not like. It's not like hell, it's not like here, there's no suffering, there's no problems, there's no nothing. So it's gone. All of everything is just gone, but it's great. It's supposed to be great. You're supposed to want it. But heaven, in fact, is actually a really problematic place in Buddhist cosmology, because you're born in heaven and you can stay there as a god for millions of eons. But the trouble with it, it's so nice there, you forget to even want to strive for enlightenment and to strive for nirvana, because you just want to stay. And so you wind up burning off all the fruits of all your meritorious actions of all your lifetimes, so that finally, when you eventually do die, it's the most poignant thing, because, say, gods in heaven, they have perfumed flesh, so like they never smell bad. They always smell good. They always levitate slightly above the ground, and they shine a little bit. So what happens when they're about to die is that they start to stink, and their flower garlands start to wilt, and oh my gosh, the time has come. And the reason why it's so poignant is that it's like instant hell for just as long, because all you have left are the accrual of your kind of bad actions over all of your lifetimes. Yeah, so it's tough. So where he threw his hair, that was one of those heavens. It's actually the heaven of the 33 gods. There are a number of different heavens, and it's the one where the king of the gods resides. So it's called the Triyastrimsha heaven, and so that's where they built the temple for the hair relic of the Buddha, the turban of the Buddha.
So where are the relics that used to be in the reliquaries?
Well, supposedly they're in little plastic bags, like in storage. Ziploc bag.
Why not?
But nobody really knows.
Would you just point out the dew catchers in the reliquary? I didn't know whether it was the round circles or the little bags on the side, or...
They're the little round circles at the top. And in fact, on this one, these are later reconstructions. In one of the ugly black and white photographs I showed earlier, there was one that still had its original dew receptacles at the top. But it's these here. And those are, in the Indic tradition, they're royal umbrellas that mark the presence of either royalty or divinity, a worshipful presence.
Yes. Statues that we see of the Buddha, the hair and the earlobes look different. Could you comment on what that means?
So the question was about the difference in the appearance of the hair and earlobes of the Buddha. And they vary radically over time and from one region to the next. The earliest depictions of the Buddha, the elongated earlobes are pretty consistent everywhere. He was a prince, and in those days it was fashionable to wear big, huge, heavy plug earrings. It's kind of fashionable now, isn't it? Or it was last year. That drag your earlobes down, and when he was a prince, he removed all of his jewelry, and so all that's left are those long, elongated earlobes. The hair is a much bigger issue, actually. It's actually a real problem because you're supposed to wear a turban in India. You're not supposed to go out with loose hair as a highborn male, and a tonsure, like having a shaven head, like the texts say the Buddha was supposed to have, it's very inauspicious. It's only like people who are widows or people who are renunciants who are outside of society have a shaven head, and they're kind of considered liminal, and they're kind of inauspicious figures. If you see one walking down the street, you have to go home and not do what you were going to do that day because it's bad luck. It's a bad omen. And so that's why the Buddha even images of the Buddha, even though the texts say he's supposed to have a shaven head like a monk, he never has a shaven head. He always has hair. And that's because I think of these taboo issues of Indian society. And so if he has hair, it's what the hair would look like underneath a turban. So if he took off his turban, actually the text can be ambiguous. You can translate chura either as hairstyle or as turban. And when he took off his chura and threw it up into heaven, what would be left underneath that would be what the hair would look like underneath, and that would be the hairstyle of a twice-born or a high-born male he was a prince. And that meant long hair that's coiled up in a top knot on top. And you never cut that top knot of hair. You can cut around it, but there's always one top knot right at the place at the top of the head, the fontanelle with babies, the soft spot of the skull. Where in India, it's thought that's where the soul can escape when it escapes the body, up at the top. You don't cut that bit of hair. And so that was a coiled top knot. And in the early sculptures, there was a top knot. And in Gandhara in the north, where there was more Greco-Roman influence, it was kind of wavy, kind of like Western-style hair. And then when that kind of Buddha image came back into India, some of the sculptors sort of misunderstood what that wavy hair was, and they made it kind of curly. And then the texts were rewritten in the 5th century looking at the sculptures, and the Buddha must have had curly hair. So there's this back and forth between text and image with a real kind of struggle as to what the Buddha looked like. Obviously icons of the Buddha, just like images of Christ, are not portraits of what he really looked like. They are symbolic icons of a devotional, worshipful being. So, and that can kind of vary culturally from one area and one culture to the next. And when Buddhism spreads, across, wildly different cultures, these elements are understood in different ways. Just like they wouldn't understand in China what an umbrella would be doing on top of a reliquary, So they said, dew catchers, right? So, so that kind of explains the differentiation in the look of the hair.
You referred to 2 pagodas, and both pagodas you mentioned were 7 stories. I was wondering if the number 7 is religiously symbolic.
Well, they originally started out being 13 stories, and they were reconstructed as 7 stories, and it can be. So, but I'm not sure in this case if it necessarily would have a particularly identifiable meaning. Sometimes, there are sets of numbers that are meaningful, like there are the 7 Manushi Buddhas, for instance. So one can interpret the 7 stories for each story being associated with one of the worldly Buddhas. There are 7 worldly Buddhas. So there are often sets of 7 stupas or 7 sacred trees because they refer to, in this time period, there are 7 Buddhas who are going to be born on this earth. And so they're called the 7 Manushi Buddhas, the human Buddhas of our eon, as it were. But that's just conjecture.
What about the story of the snails? Instead of the snails when he was under
So there was a question about that. There's a story about the snails when he was under the Bodhi tree is what made the snail shell curls. That's a much, much, much later accretion and story. And the snail shell curls go much farther back to about the 4th century and are, like I said, probably derived from stylized and formalized depictions of Gandharan wavy locks of hair. But I think that story came post hoc, as it were.